Yeah, we are going to start. So today we are going to listen to PhilipWood. PhilipWood is a full professor at the Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilization at Aga Khan University, London. He has been a British Academy postdoctoral fellow and taught at Oxford, Cambridge, and SOAS in London. He studies West Asia before and after the Arab conquests, and he's particularly interested in the history of the Christian communities of Syria and Iraq and the formation of group identities. His publications include We Have No King But Christ with OUP, and again with OUP, a book on the Chronicle of Sirte, the Chronicle of Sirte, the Christian historical imagination in late antique Iraq. And now in 2021, a new book came out, The Imam of the Christian, The Word of Dionysius of Del Mare with Princeton University Press. Today, Philip will talk of accounts of the Arab conquests of the 7th century in the Chronicle of Michael the Syrian, and he will examine the relationship between Miaphysites and Chalcedonians through an analysis of some passages of Michael. So Philip, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. For both Christians and Muslims in the Middle East, the Arab conquests of the 7th century were momentous events that seemed to have wider religious significance. For some, the conquests seemed to demonstrate the superiority of Muslims and the truth of Islam. The Futuh narratives, the Arabic accounts of a divinely mandated conquest, describe Roman Christians as morally corrupt. It describes their abandonment of true religion and therefore their defeat to Muslim opponents. And even to Christian critics of Islam, the defeat of the Christians posed a near unanswerable question. As the prospect of a Roman reconquest waned, some Christians within the Caliphate sought to distance themselves from the Roman Empire and the Roman past. This distancing occurred at different rates and in different places, but it was broadly a function of the empire's political weakness and the ongoing vacillation over Christology and the use of icons. Now, some modern historians have seen the Arab conquest as a major moment of opportunity for heretical Christians, such as the Miaphysites in the Roman Near East. Geoffrey de Sainte-Croix, whose quotation is provided here, saw the Chalcedonian persecution of Miaphysites receive a just reward when Miaphysites assisted the invaders. Now, de Sainte-Croix's view is now widely thought to be false in academic circles, but it was based on primary sources, namely on the Syriac Chronicle of Michael the Syrian. And in this paper, I'd like to examine the depiction of the Arab conquest in Michael. My aim is to assess the passages that depict the emperor's relationship with Miaphysites both before and during the Arab conquests. And these are Heraclius's meeting with the Miaphysite patriarch Athanasius Gamala in Edessa, and then the Arabs' defeat of the Roman general David. So here I've tried to put down a summary of the content of Michael's Chronicle. As I'm sure most of you know, it's divided into 3 columns for much of the material. So I've tried to reflect that in my slide here. And the bit I'm going to be talking about is in red. Heraclius and the Miaphysites. A core narrative runs through the account of political and military events between 850 and 630. And it's one that Michael shares, at least in outline, with the Greek historian Theophanes. For our purposes, it's noticeable that Michael receives Heraclean propaganda quite positively. The chief villains of his narrative are the Persian Shah Khosrow and the Roman usurper Phocas. There's no clear anti-Chalcedonian sentiment. When the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Zacharias, is deported by Khosrow, we're only told that he's a Chalcedonian in an explanatory note. There's no invective. Heraclius' visit to Edessa in the aftermath of his victory in the Persian War is probably the most detailed scene devoted to the emperor in the Chronicle. It shows considerable internal variation and uses multiple sources with different agendas, and I summarize it here for reference. So this is book 11, chapter 3. So it describes how Heraclius enters Edessa and distributes largesse, but he's banned from communion by the zealous metropolitan Isaiah, and Heraclius is furious. Then Isaiah leaves the church along with noble families from Edessa, the Russophia, the Telmachraya, and others, who themselves given gifts to the church before the Roman victory. In scene 3, Athanasios Gamala, who's the Patriarch of Antioch, meets Heraclius together with his bishops. And there Heraclius asks for a libellus about their belief and asks to receive communion if he states that he will accept two natures in Christ united in a single will and operation. But when the bishops, and this is scene 4, when the bishops see that he's in accord with Nestorius and Pope Leo, they refuse, and Heraclius is again furious. He writes to the whole empire, ordering them to mutilate anyone who rejects Chalcedon. So scene 4 presents Heraclius as a persecutor. And then scene 5, we've got a number of monks of unstated earlier confession who go over to Chalcedon, especially at Beth Maron. And I think this is a story about the origins of the Maronites, which I'm not really going to discuss here. And then finally, scene 6, a concluding comment that says that the God is punishing the Romans for the theft of the Miaphysite churches by giving over the empire to the Ishmaelites. And this is the section that excited Geoffrey de Saint Croix so much. I should note that these, what I've called my 6 different scenes, these are my own impositions, so they're not Michael's divisions within his text. Scene 2 shows a clear interest in the changing fate of church property, and it links it to the aristocratic families in Edessa. This is taken to be the key effect of theological disagreement, and the narrative functions as a claim by a recently disenfranchised group of elites. Notably, these families were ancestors of the historian Dionysius of Telmachraya, and it seems likely to me that this account, like others, have been transmitted by Dionysius' own relative, Daniel of Torabdin, who was Dionysius' grandfather and was himself a historian. But when Heraclius enters Edessa after his victory in scene 1, he's depicted very positively. There's no suggestion that his largesse is an attempt to win over people to heresy, or that the monks he greets are somehow apostates. Now, it's dangerous to read too much into texts that have been abbreviated and have additions from later editors, like Michael's text. But an editor with a sectarian agenda would have probably played up distinctions between the Miaphysites and the Chalcedonians rather than minimizing them. And the end of this scene, which starts to depict Heraclius as a brutal persecutor. So I suggest that the editing process has allowed different representations of the emperor by different historians to stand alongside one another. I think it's quite noteworthy that in this passage, it's Isaiah rather than Heraclius who comes across as intransigent and intolerant. The representation of Isaiah suggests to me an Edessene author to whom the victorious Heraclius was an impressive figure, who blamed Isaiah for the insult and for the noble's loss of property and influence. So I think that's the core layer of this material. Isaiah's belligerent behavior is rooted in the fact that he was one of the bishops appointed by Eastern Miaphysites, that is, Miaphysites from the Sasanian Empire, during Khusro's occupation of Edessa. And Isaiah's predecessor as Bishop of Edessa, Paul, was still alive while Isaiah was in office. So I think he was a figure with quite slender legitimacy. So Isaiah was associated with the Persian occupation, and he may have lacked the kind of local links that would have encouraged compromise with an emperor like Heraclius. Athanasius Gamala and Heraclius. Now, the presentation of Heraclius' position to Athanasius in scene 3 is not polemical. It appeals to a single will and energy in Christ, and it seems to be an attempt to make a two-nature Christology seem plausible. It seems to build on earlier thoughts within Neo-Chalcedonianism, in which Chalcedonian monenergists and then monothelites stressed that their position was in accordance with Cyril of Alexandria, the 5th century opponent of Nestorius, who was revered by the Miaphysites. Now, though it's not alluded to in the passage I quote here, Athanasius was a member of a prominent family who already had connections with Roman authorities. PhilipWood has argued that Athanasius spent the Roman-Persian wars in Roman-occupied Cyprus, and the assistance of the Roman government ought to explain the ability of Miaphysites in Antioch, led by Athanasius, to then establish control over Miaphysites in the Sasanian Empire through the foundation of a new see at Crete. Elsewhere in Michael's Chronicle, there are letters preserved that really confirm the tenor of the account in scene 3 on the slide in front of you. They suggest that the correspondence between Heraclius and Athanasius was in fact fairly cordial, if not conclusive. In scene 3 on this slide, Heraclius refers to the Miaphysites as diakrinomenoi, hesitators. It's a term that avoids polemical labels that imply that there are followers of a heresiarch, such as Eutychians or Severans. Heraclius's letter stresses his devotion to Mary as Mother of God, a reference both to her role in saving Constantinople during the siege of 626, but also her significance as Theotokos, as God-bearer, which is an anti-Nestorian symbol. Heraclius emphasizes that he believes in two natures of God that are not confused in one another, but are united in a single will. And he affirms his allegiance to the faith proclaimed at Chalcedon. But he also considers that this faith is compatible with Cyril of Alexandria's Miaphysitism, of a single nature in the incarnate word of God, which is a key slogan for Miaphysite churches. In his reply, in this same section, Athanasius sets out his objections to Chalcedon and the Tome of Leo, but he still establishes considerable common ground with Heraclius in his allegiance to the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople and his devotion to Mary. Athanasius refers to Heraclius as the philanthropic and peaceful emperor, and Athanasius asserts his differences firmly, but he's not belligerent. It's only in scene 4 that the depiction of Heraclius changes and becomes markedly more polemical. From this point, the bishops simply reject his position. He's the Chalcedonian, and imply that any kind of compromise between Miaphysites and Chalcedonians was simply impossible. Scene 4's representation of the encounter implies that the debate was and should be conducted only at the level of slogans and symbols, the Synod of Chalcedon, the Tome of Leo, rather than any substantive discussion of theology, which is in fact what does seem to have occurred in the letters exchanged between Athanasius and Heraclius. Heraclius's response, which is to mutilate anyone who would reject Chalcedon, presents him as a bloodthirsty persecutor. So according to the author of scene 4, it's the threat of persecution rather than the attraction of monenergism, of a kind of compromised doctrine, that led parts of Syria to go over to Heraclius. And as Phil Booth has commented, the narratives of violence like this might have functioned as a fig leaf to disguise or explain away the real success of monenergism in this period. The same events that are described in book 11, chapter 3 in Michael are also described by the Greek historian Theophanes. But here, Theophanes depicts Athanasius as accepting Diaphysitism, and then asks whether or not Christ has a single or a double will. In Theophanes' account, Sergius, Patriarch of Constantinople, was a major proponent of monenergism. But Theophanes imagines that monenergism was also a response to Athanasius' cunning questioning. For Theophanes, the Miaphysites saw Sergius' monenergism as a great victory. And the Miaphysites in Theophanes' account say, it is not we who've communicated with Chalcedon, but rather Chalcedon that's communicated with us by confessing one nature of Christ through one energy. So Theophanes' account is highly polemical, and it probably garbles its representation of monenergism as an idea that's created by Athanasius. But nevertheless, there's a core idea in Theophanes' account that does support the image of Athanasius and Heraclius given in the letters, namely that their meeting was civil and collaborative. It was only after the monenergist formula had lost its prestige that later historians underplayed the degree to which there had been real and persuasive consensus. This later disavowal of monenergism by both Chalcedonians and Miaphysites allow it to be presented as a plot by the other party, which conceals its real ability to persuade both sides for this brief moment in history after the defeat of the Persians. So I would argue there was a reality of compromise, which in many cases led to shared communion and reconciliation. And this was rewritten in later times to present early 7th century actors, imagining them as much more unbending and inflexible than they were in reality. A farewell to Syria. So I move now to the discussion of Heraclius' war with the Arabs. and his fighting retreat from Syria. And I'm going to discuss the text in yellow on the slide here. Now, most of Michael's narratives here describe the fate of individual Roman generals. Most of these generals are condemned, either for their arrogance and their mistreatment of the locals, or for their persecution of Miaphysites. And Heraclius himself is said at one point to have allowed his troops to pillage Syria. Our source here laments that the Romans did more damage than the Arabs. The flagship example of the Romans' disavowal of Syria and the locals' disavowal of the Romans comes in the conflict between the commanders David and Titus. This is set shortly after the Caliph Muawiyah has broken through the Roman fortifications at Calasura in the Taurus Mountains in about 662. Michael describes how David, who's an Armenian, takes an army from Constantinople, enters Syria and finds it empty of Arab soldiers. And the Arabs were at that time destroying another Roman army under one Valentinus. David's soldiers then loot a Syrian village called Beth Ma'ada, torture the Christian inhabitants to get them to reveal where they've hidden their wealth, and rape women in front of their husbands. One Titus, who is a Miaphysite, is present during these atrocities and sees that David does not reprimand his soldiers. He tells him, "Since you are a Christian, it's not fitting that you should use your swords against fellow Christians. The emperor would not support you if he'd learnt that you'd entered a land to pillage it and burn it." And Titus then frees a large number of people whom the Armenians in David's army had taken captive. Next, Iyad, the Arab commander, hears stories that David was threatening Damascus and goes to face him. And on the Arabs' approach, the Armenians take flight and they abandon the defensive trenches that they dug. The Arabs then gleefully attack them piecemeal. David appeals to Titus and his men to come to help him. He says, "Now is the moment to show your affection to the Romans." But Titus responds, "If I were to follow you, I would not be followed by the Lord." David is then killed along with many of those who stood with him, and Titus goes to take refuge in Amida. The force of this story is that the Romans have failed to acknowledge the solidarity that binds all Christians. The author feels that common religion ought to generate common loyalties. In pillaging Beth Ma'ada, David's forces show that they are not real Christians, though Titus is absolved from blame by his abandonment of David. So the narrative grapples with the unraveling of Roman Christian solidarity. A force that had been so powerful only a few years before the Persian Wars had lost its purchase for former members of the Roman army, who now scattered to cities that lay beyond the fighting. The narrative could reflect a point of composition a generation after the events it describes, as men like Titus defended their reputations and represented the Roman military as unchristian and irresponsible. At the same time, the narrative also absolves local men who'd served in the army from being tarred by accusations of looting. A military background might be remembered long after the war itself. For instance, one Miaphysite patriarch of Antioch was called Julian the Roman, because his father was an Armenian soldier who'd served under the Romans under David and then taken a Suriaya wife. The sharp distinction between the forces of David and Titus in the narrative allows the reader to imagine good soldiers and bad soldiers, with the latter as outsiders. Nevertheless, we should note that the author passes up any attempt to generate religious invective. David's lack of Christianity is illustrated solely in his behavior rather than his beliefs, and there doesn't seem to be any religious polemic to the identification of his men as Armenians. Finally, the text also distinguishes David's atrocities from the wishes of the emperor Heraclius. Titus warns David that Heraclius will not approve of his actions. For this author, the emperor is absolved of the bloodshed of his troops because of his ignorance, which is a rather different emphasis from some other passages in Michael. Now, this distinction between David and Heraclius would be heightened if Jean-Baptiste Chabot was correct in identifying David as David Saharuni. Saharuni participated, according to the Armenian historian Sebeos, in a failed coup against Heraclius, but later managed to escape from imprisonment and was subsequently appointed to be governor of Armenia and Kuropalatis for 3 years in the late 630s after being acclaimed by the Armenian princes. However, the Armenian princes expelled him after ruling for 3 years, and he was subsequently employed as a Roman general, which is where we meet him here. An ally of David Saharuni was Valentinus, who had a similar background and a similar colourful career. He too was a member of the Armenian nobility. Valentinus survived the conflict in Syria and went on to participate in a coup against Heraclius's widow Martina soon afterwards in 641. So if Chabot is correct in identifying the David here in Michael with the David in Sebeos, then the author of this scene might have been describing a number of different Armenian villains who were already known to the reader as untrustworthy servants of the emperor, one of whom had attempted a coup against Heraclius before this battle, and one who would do so again against his widow. Agenda, authorship, and dating. How then should we treat the narratives preserved in Michael? Are there any indications of the kind of anti-Chalcedonian, anti-Roman sentiment that de Sainte-Croix observed? The extracts I've discussed here carry a core that look to me like 7th century compositions. They tell how Heraclius attempted a reconciliation with Miaphysites in Edessa, but was defied by the bishop Isaiah, who had been an Eastern appointee. Heraclius then attempted a compromise with Athanasius Gamala. Later on, Michael reports a scorched earth policy by the Romans during the retreat from Syria, but there seems to have been considerable confusion over whether or not to blame the emperor himself for this, or incompetent generals on the spot. Local men served in the Roman army, and there was an attempt to differentiate between these and badly behaved outsiders. Christology does not function as a strong boundary between actors in most of these narratives. In the arrival of Heraclius at Edessa, it is Isaiah, not Heraclius, who's blamed for the breakdown of the relationship. Athanasius's quarrel with Heraclius shows signs of later editing, where there are substantial differences in attitude towards Heraclius in the narrative that Michael quotes and the documents that Michael himself uses. John of Ephesus was a Syriac Miaphysite historian who wrote in the 580s, and he attempted to criticize tyrannical individuals rather than Chalcedonians as a whole. John of Ephesus had treated the Emperor Justin II or the Patriarch John Scholasticos in a way that was highly critical, but John did not extend that criticism to all Chalcedonians. He praised the emperors Tiberius and Maurice. John of Ephesus differentiated between individuals on the basis of their actions rather than generalizing about entire confessions. And I would argue that the author of the passages that we've been looking at here was similarly discriminating. His criticism is for Isaiah and David rather than the emperor or the Romans as a whole. And on this basis, I believe the bulk of the narrative we've seen is plausibly a product of the 7th century. However, there are also significant interventions in the text made by other authors. Heraclius is promised to mutilate the Miaphysites, or the comment that Arab rule is better than the tyranny of the Romans makes better sense in a mid-8th century context or later, where the success of monothelitism came to be explained away as Roman coercion, and when the hopes of a Roman reconquest had faded away. Reference to specific aristocratic donors to the Miaphysite church in Edessa may suggest that the possible author of some of these interpolations was one Daniel of Tur-Abdin, who was a member of the Rosophia family and grandfather to the Syriac historian Dionysius of Tel Mahre. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very interesting paper with very interesting material. We opened the arena to people to ask questions. Please do so either by raising the electronic hand in a corner or by waving at me. I think I can see everyone at the same time. I might perhaps start. I'm curious whether there are other sources. So you starting from Michael the Syrian, are there other sources for what you're describing, well, around that area in general? No, you don't necessarily need to pin it down to 1 century. Is this isolated sort of source, or there is a full genre, fully blown, that explains the differences and fights between Chalcedonian and Miaphysites? In this sense, in this way, please.
In this way, so I think these are the most, I think you get the sources with this kind of polemical edge, in terms of Christology. I think that the one strand are the sources you see with Michael and the Chronicle of 1234, which probably depend on a common source like Dionysius of Telmare. That's not to say Dionysius is the person who initiates these interventions. And then I think also the Egyptian sources show a similar shift. So the history of the patriarchs of Alexandria, I think, also shows this shift against Chalcedonians, the depiction of Chalcedonians as persecutors. But again, I think that we're dealing with, that's also a layered source where you have a sort of, the narrative's been altered as time has gone on, and the a greater hostility between Chalcedonians and Miaphysites has been imagined by the author than what actually occurred on the spot. And I think one of the reasons for I think there was a reality of compromise, which a lot of which was facilitated by Heraclius's victory and by these compromise formulae like monergism and monothelitism.
Thank you. We have a question from Johannes and Heyer, please.
Yeah, well, yes, just because you're mentioning can you hear me?
I can, yes, thank you.
Okay. Thank you for mentioning the history of the patriarchs of Alexandria. And indeed, as you're saying, it's a multi-layered text. And what's going on there, as I've tried to demonstrate some 20 years ago, is that the Arabic version that we have may be pretty much distorted, and it's not only a question of various redactions of the Arabic text, but also the fact that the text was written in Coptic and that the Coptic original is lost. And so the point I tried to make in that project was that there was a specific purpose which says more about the setting in which the Arabic text, as we know, it was produced, and which was in the Fatimid period, so you're talking about several centuries later, and that it's really to be read as a claim towards a favorable position of the Coptic community in that particular period. So by emphasizing the cordial relations between Abnabal as the conqueror and the Coptic patriarch after a period of oppression by Heraclius, and most of all by Cyrus, the Mokawkis, as it's called in the Arabic source. It kind of shows a very stark contrast between the oppression, the previous oppression, and then the moment of liberation. But I should stress that there's only a moment of liberation, conceived liberation, because as soon as this kind of jubilant episode is over, we go back to oppression, the same kind of oppression, this time coming from our successor. So it's really to be read as something from a later period that projects reality. So thank you very much. And in this, I think the second slide, where about David the Armenian, I couldn't help noticing that in the third column there was some remark by, well, whoever it was, but in Michael's text, about the Egyptian handing over their country to the Arabs because of the yes, there it is. The Egyptians hand over the countries because of the oppression of the Romans, and also take the churches of the Chalcedonians. Interestingly, the taking over the churches of the Chalcedonians, as far as I remember, is not there in the history of the patriarchs, at least not at that point in time. It is mentioned, but much later. So that may say something about the way that information reached Michael or whoever was responsible for writing this.
So I think those scenes about the persecution of the Egyptians are received into the Syriac tradition by Dionysius of Telmare.
Yes.
Who, I mean, he refers to discussions he has about history in Egypt. So I suspect that also the scene involving Benjamin also occurs. Is that here? No, I haven't. That happens. Sorry, that happens later on. But those occur during his visits to. So he's invited by the Caliph al-Ma'mun to act as a go-between during the Bashmuraic revolts.
Exactly.
And during this visit, he also has time to do some sightseeing. He goes to the pyramids and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
The Nilometer, but he also has a number of discussions with Coptic bishops who talk to him about history, and he seems to delight in correcting them, and sort of you get a sort of snide remarks about their ignorance. But I think this is the moment when his historical tradition becomes, the Syriac historical tradition becomes aware of this Egyptian turn. That's not to say that I think Dionysius necessarily endorses this or produces this kind of material in the Syriac tradition, but I think it's when he becomes aware of this strand of Egyptian material. I think one of the ways that Dionysius structures his history is his interest in the relationship between Antioch and Alexandria. And he's operating in an era when that's been really in abeyance for a long time, and he's restoring a relationship between the two patriarchates that hasn't really existed since the beginning of the 7th century. So I think one of the ways that he champions his own involvement in Egyptian affairs, which is facilitated by his patron Abdallah ibn Tahir, one of the ways that he champions that is stressing these that Egypt goes through a similar kind of trajectory to the Patriarchate of Antioch. So I think he's responsible for that kind of material.
Sounds very convincing to me. Thank you.
Other questions are very welcome, if anyone wants to jump in. Georgia, beat me to the punch, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, one of the questions has been addressed partially already, because you mentioned Dionysius and other possible sources, because I gather that the problem of authorship is one of the central and biggest one in this kind of text and approach. So I was wondering whether you could expand a bit more on that, even if you started doing so already with Dionysius.
Yes. So perhaps I've got a slide on this, so maybe I can. Sorry, I'll just go back to my slides and then I can answer this better. So I think for the 7th century, we've got sort of 5 layers of possible authorship for Michael's, for the material that appears in Michael. So we know that he relies on a Syriac Miaphysite historian called Qura of Batna, whose works are not extant but are quoted in Michael. Diakonov thought that all the material, or some of the material that I've discussed today, he thought that 11.3 is from Qura of Batna. But this is very complicated, and a lot relies on the accurate transmission of the introduction of Michael, which is only extant in Armenian. So if that, it depends whether that transmission is garbled. But the Armenian text attributes 2 works. It says that Qura wrote an ecclesiastical history that ended with Heraclius and also discussed the Arab conquests. So if that introduction is correct, then Qura could be the author of much of this material. The problem is that Dionysius says that he began from where Qura ended, and Dionysius begins with the reign of Maurice. So there's a contradiction there, and most people have resolved that in favor of the Syriac. And then there's a number of these 8th century figures who wrote kind of quasi-ecclesiastical history, not sort of things that approached ecclesiastical history, but weren't the real thing from Dionysius' point of view. And one of these is Dionysius' own grandfather, Daniel of Torabdin. And I think the section that talks about the aristocrats leaving Edessa is probably from Daniel of Torabdin. And then we've got Dionysius himself. And then Dionysius goes on to be himself a major source for the Chronicle of 1234 and for Michael. Sorry, it's so complicated. There's not really another way of doing it that I've been able to find. So the question is, who's responsible for the kind of twist that represents the Romans as persecutors? At what level does that occur? I once thought it was Dionysius himself, but as I read more widely in the corpus of what Dionysius's own writings, my impression of Dionysius is he's not particularly concerned about the Chalcedonians, that he has other fish to fry. It's not that he's necessarily ecumenical, but his primary concerns are schisms within his own church rather than writing polemic against the Chalcedonians. And Dionysius often passes up opportunities to present the Chalcedonians as disloyal. So often there's moments where he could make an alignment between Chalcedonians in the Caliphate and the Roman Empire, and he doesn't do so. So I think that by the time Dionysius is writing, it's no longer the prime issue of his day. I think he just simply transmits a lot of his earlier sources. When he's writing about his own times, he's not interested in what the Chalcedonians are up to. So I think those kinds of interventions have happened in the 8th century in Dionysius' source tradition, and maybe someone like Daniel of Torabdin is responsible for this twist, this rendering the material more anti-Roman, more anti-Chalcedonian, and that would roughly chime with what Phil Booth has seen in the Egyptian sources, or similar arguments by Ed Zigovitz-Coghill. So I would see a mid-8th century twist in the sources that starts to distance the Miaphysites from the Chalcedonian Romans, tries to draw that distinction. Have I answered your question, Georgia?
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
I believe Zara is next, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Phil, for this really interesting paper. You can probably predict what kind of questions I'm going to ask. Firstly, I'm surprised that David Saharuni, or if it is him, is presented as a Roman, so implying he's a Chalcedonian, which is not something we find in the Armenian sources. Obviously, he built the Church of Meren, where he has the representation of the restitution of the cross, so very much anyways, lining himself up under Heraclius. So I find it really interesting that the Chalcedonians are represented by Armenians, and I wonder how normal it is for a Syriac source, where they would probably not always write friendly things about Armenians, but rarely line them up as normally Chalcedonian. Being Armenian does not imply being Chalcedonian.
No.
But the other, more like a comment or a question, it would be interesting to compare the Armenian variants of Michael the Syrian and see how these episodes are presented, if they add or stuff from Armenian sources, or they change it. And, each translation has its own specifics. So there are not two versions, but there are two interpretations of Michael the Syrian. So I wonder if that would be, and this reminds me, this entire story of Romans or Armenian Romans switching allegiance. It would be interesting to trace these topos in general, because there is sort of like a folkloristic Armenian source, which presents a similar switch of positions. It's very interesting because it presents the Armenians in a horrible light. They are first the allies of the Romans, but then at some point they decide this is not very useful. So they cut the cords of Pantoum Bridge, and the Romans are all fall into the water, and the Persians, they call them, probably meaning Muslims, massacre them. And we find this in two sources. One is an 8th century Revond, and the other one is probably a late 9th century elaboration, which incorporates also folkloric material. So this is a second strand that one may want to see what's going on here as far as topoi are concerned beyond historical reconstruction. Thank you so much. It was really fascinating.
Oh, thank you so much. That's really useful. So I'll look into those. And I have read the Armenian versions in translation, but I can't remember looking at this scene. And so so thank you. I'll go away and do that. I'll look again at David, possibly Saharuni, and see about that. I think that maybe the answer in terms of it's rare to see the Armenians depicted as Chalcedonian, maybe the answer is simply to say that 11.10 in Michael isn't actually interested in Christology. And that's been, and that whether or not the Suriaye or the Armenians are Chalcedonian or Miaphysite is actually irrelevant to the author.
Yeah, that confirms what you were saying also before.
Yeah. That Suriaye in this text doesn't have a Christological implication.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. Jos Verheiden, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for a fine survey. I have two comments. I'm sorry, but I was interrupted by a phone call, so I may have missed what you said. But at one point you said, this looks very much like 7th century material to me. But I have not heard the argument for that.
Oh, okay.
Was there no argument? I don't know. But then the phone went. Then the phone went up. And the second thing, when one reads these texts, and especially in this motif of blame it on the Orthodox, on the Chalcedonians, the term that comes to mind is resentment, of course. So this is what these people do. They rather die than become that and anything like that. So this is a well-known phenomenon, of course, resentment. But does it always work in the same way when you write this kind of stuff, let's say, when the facts are happening, and when you transmit this kind of stuff 3-4 centuries later, when everything is actually changed? And I would like to know, do you have any thoughts on that? Because one can have some sympathy for the resentment when things happening, and then you say these kind of things, or you write these kind of things. But 4 centuries later, what is this still? What's the effect of such things by then?
Thank you. So my argument for a 7th century point of composition is that in general, I think we're going to have movement towards greater separation of Miaphysites and Chalcedonians, and that the early 7th century is a moment of relative reconciliation in the aftermath of the Heraclean victory and in the establishment of monergism as a compromise doctrine in some ways. It draws on Severan ideas, among other things. Also, when Heraclius is prepared to have Athanasius Gamala, who's already been in contact with him in Cyprus, as his sole Patriarch of Antioch. So he's going to have a standing Miaphysite as he's going to liquidate any Chalcedonian lineage as Patriarchs of Antioch. The current Patriarch of Antioch is going to lose his job in favor of Athanasius. So it's a moment of substantial compromise on both sides, and it's been made possible by this victory. So I would see the bits of the text that are relatively Irenic as more likely to be early. So the question is then, when does the twist happen? When is when does this material become more barbed? The Christological differences become more polemical. I think that's probably a feature of, both for internal textual reasons and by comparison to places like Egypt, I think this is a function of the middle of the 8th century. And some of that, it's also the kinds of divisions that get picked up on in an Egyptian context by people like Ibn Abd al-Hakam, who begin to conceive of the Copts as the conquered people who don't resist, and the Romans as the people who resist and are deservedly expelled. So I think Muslims also begin to pick up this on this Christological division and start to implement it, utilize it themselves. Have I answered your question?
Yeah. No, thank you.
Thank you very much. Unless I've missed any hand up in any way.
There's a comment in the chat then.
Yeah, there are 2 questions. So one is Zara's comment. Zara, would you like to comment on it, please?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote thinking, I don't want to take other people's turn to ask questions, but I'm thinking the switch of attitude, not that it grows out of, but it's parallel with also an ecclesiastical form of drawing the boundaries at the Council of Manzikert between the Armenians and Syrians, called by John of Ozun. You know, he's a big theologian. So I'm wondering if one could or should connect what you see, a switch in attitude, also to a switch structurally somehow, formulating in an ecclesiastical council who we are, the Miaphysites, and why it is important for us to present ourselves as a common front. You know, we are talking about 7, if I'm not mistaken, 26 Council of Manzikert. So Byzantium is sort of irrelevant somehow from Lake Van, you know, seen from there. So I'm wondering if this should be considered together, or could be, or would it be useful?
Thank you. That's very useful, and it would match the timing as well. So the source critically, it looks to me like people like Daniel of Torabdin are writing, writing chiefly around events in the 740s and 50s. That's when Michael becomes dense again. So there is a large note on the Council of Manzikert, but it really sits on its own. Before and after that, there's not much. It's pretty sparse. And then suddenly you get the Council of Manzikert and you get this long list of bishops, but then you don't really get much follow-up, and you don't hear about Armenia again for a century or longer. And then you hear nothing about the Council of Shirakavan. So the Council of Manzikert is sort of there on its own. So I've never been sure what to do with it, and I don't know how it ends up getting into Michael either. So I don't know whether it was transmitted through Dionysius or not. I guess my on the other side, the devil's advocate for that argument would be that some of the sources seem to portray Armenia as much more Julianist or aphthartic at this period. So I wondered if whether we can talk about Miaphysitism as a united front is a bit more problematic.
Sure, yeah, it may be a simplification, but just what comes to mind is actually more studies on connections of John of Ozun with the Syriac world would be really desirable.
It would be interesting. I mean, it makes enough of a splash to be included, and there's so few events that Michael includes for the early 8th century at all.
Yeah.
And it's also in a period before the I think I'd call them Jacobites by that stage, but before they're actually having their own church councils.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
We have a question from Mihaela, please.
Hi, Philip. Thank you very much for this very elegant presentation and highly critical regard to the sources used, which is very necessary. I have a question. Maybe we will have the chance to develop it elsewhere later on. During your research, have you encountered references to dualists, Zoroastrians or Manichaeans, either in a polemical way or as by solidarity with Miaphysites?
Well, there is references to Manichaees in passing, I think, in the in theological discussion, but they're not really mentioned in the canonical literature. So they do appear. It's this theological position you have to argue against. But I wonder if, at least in the places that are generating church canons, they don't seem to be I'm not aware of any canons, for instance, saying that you can't marry Manichaees. Whereas you do get canons to say you can't marry Jews, Zoroastrians, Muslims, and Chalcedonians. So I don't see them as a major social presence, but clearly those ideas are sufficiently alive, maybe in other parts of the caliphate, that people do need to argue against their theological ideas, which is a different thing, I guess. And then Michael has these descriptions of groups that look like, and Patricia Crone has written about this, that groups that look like members of an Iranian dualist religion that is not Zoroastrianism. But I mean, that's been well discussed already, so I didn't really touch that in my book.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I believe Barbara has a comment. Can you speak to it, please? Barbara?
Sorry, yeah, I wrote my comment in the chat because I thought otherwise I immediately lose my own thought. But yeah, so what was I saying? I've come across these comments in Miaphysite texts about how Islam was brought as a punishment to the rule of the Chalcedonians, but I often feel these comments are only meant to explain why Islam came and why now there's this other rule, and they don't really say anything about real attitudes in the 7th century of Miaphysites to the Chalcedonians. But maybe I'm just reading it in a one-sided way. I don't know. It's not specifically about Michael the Syrian, but more about what I've come across, especially in apocalyptic texts.
When do these texts date from?
Well, a lot of them are hard to date, of course, but I think from the 9th century onward. Yeah.
I mean, I think the Arab conquests have to be seen as totally stunning, and they're incredible, like jaw-dropping, incredible actions that would have, I think, have made many people think that you needed to find some kind of miraculous explanation, especially because they occur in the aftermath of Heraclius' own victory, which itself had all this eschatological reading. So it seems to undermine Roman prestige in such a fundamental way. And I think for all Christians, as well as Muslims, it leads to theological experimentation of different kinds. And I think it must have been a factor that leads people to collaborate with the Muslims or convert to Islam. And sometimes that's expressed in Christological terms, but I don't think it has to be. And of course, it's hard to differentiate that just from opportunism. And John of Nicu talks about people helping the Arabs, but it's unclear that they're doing so because of Christological differences. Mm-hmm. And of course, iconoclasm also, I think, has to be seen as a reaction to Arab military success. So in a sense, when we're talking about the role of sharpening Christological differences as a result of the Arab victories, that's only one of a number of different axes that get stimulated by this eschatologically charged event. Right. But yes, I think so. I guess the problem for reading Michael or for reading these Coptic texts has to be how we date them. And there's much more incentive to create an image of the Arabs punishing the Chalcedonian Romans in an era when you know the Arabs are going to, relatively speaking, be on your side, not theirs. Mm-hmm. Where you have a sense that you've got good links to patronage.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hidemi?
Sorry. Thanks, Philip, for that very good analysis of what's happening in the 7th, 8th century period. But of course, as you know, I'm more interested in the later period of 12th, 13th century. Now, I'm just wondering if, is Michael doing anything with these texts? Is he just copying them, or do you have any feeling that Michael's changing it? You can't tell, of course, but without the
there's a few places. I think there's a few places you can tell where we can compare 1234 to Michael. We can see differences in emphasis. So it's clear from that comparison that, for instance, the notion of Isaiah being intransigent is much clearer in 1234.
Okay.
And he's made to look like not zealous, but a zealous idiot. And he's a moron. He's the person who blew it. And that comes across much more clearly in 1234. In Michael, you kind of have to, you only get that if you're reading between the lines. So I think that's a case of.
Which is more original? Is the account in 1234 more closer to the original? Is Michael sort of lessening the?
I think Michael's taken the sting out of the barb. Michael's reduced it. But perhaps it may be that Michael's, because 1234.
Yeah, and of course, then why would he do that? That's the question.
So I think that Michael, unlike Dionysius, is writing in an environment where there are kind of, partly in the aftermath of the Crusades, partly in the aftermath of the resurgence of Byzantine power, that Chalcedonians are more of a political threat than they had been under Dionysius.
Yeah.
And so I think that becomes an issue in Michael's era in a way that it hadn't been for Ignatius or for Dionysius. So I think there's a sense then in which there's bits of the early agenda that are quite suitable for Michael's agenda. And Michael kind of revivifies that. So the point I wanted to kind of get across is that I think that in Dionysius's reign, writing at the height of the Abbasid Caliphate, the Romans have become relatively peripheral, and I think that's but Michael is writing at a time of sort of Roman or at least Chalcedonian resurgence, so that becomes a much more of a live issue.
Yeah.
There are a few other little differences. So Titus is referred to as a Suriaya in the Chronicle of 1234, and that doesn't appear in Michael. But I don't really want
what to make of that is okay. Thank you very much. Thanks. Just thoughts of that. Yeah.
Thank you. But Bar-Hebraeus obviously has access to these sources, he obviously has access to Dionysius, but it's much more heavily abbreviated in Bar-Hebraeus.
It is. He usually says, it will be.
Oh, the section on Julian the Roman, that comes out of Bar-Hebraeus when he talks about Julian the Roman being of Armenian and Suriaya parentage. That comes from Bar-Hebraeus. And that's probably also from via Dionysius.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Thoughts and comments. Yeah.
Thank you. Unless I've missed a raised hand, I'd like to, I'm sure they all will join me in thanking Philip for a very interesting paper, and thanks everyone for joining in and for joining the conversation. Good seeing everyone, and very much look forward to seeing everyone next time.
Thank you for having me.
Anytime, thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Have a good day, everyone.
Good day.
Bye. Bye-bye.